In this segment, we are going to learn how to throw a bowl out of a couple pounds of clay on the potter's wheel. So in this video, we're going to go through all of the basics between all the way from the very beginning in terms of body posture and the way that we apply the clay to the wheel, and then the entire process from centering to pulling to shaping the walls and then finishing. So the first thing we have to think about whenever we are getting ready to throw at the potter's wheel is our body position and placement against the wheel. So we have our wheel head, we have the basin around it, we have our body. Our stool should be all the way up touching the back of the wheel so that we can be as close to the center of the wheel as possible. Next, you will sit on that stool that is right up against. You're going to take your legs and wrap your legs as far around the wheel as you possibly can. This forces you to be all the way tight with the wheel. So now you have stability. Stability is very important whenever you're wheel throwing. And so now that our body is wrapped around the wheel, we can actually kind of squeeze our legs just a little bit to help us keep ourselves connected and tight with the potter's wheel. The foot pedal is down here on my right hand side. That is what's going to spin the wheel. You'll notice that the wheel has variable speeds. I can go really slow or I can go really fast. You will find that at times you'll need to do a little bit of both. But for the majority of what we do, we will be working about medium speed with the potter's wheel. Medium speed to a little faster is where we will center. Then a little bit slower is where we will work on pulling the wall, because we want to be very careful with the amount of speed that we have the taller our clay gets. So now that we understand where our body should be around the potter's wheel, we understand where the energy for the wheel comes from, which is the foot pedal down to our right. We now need to talk about our arms and positioning of our arms. So our arms, if we have our arms out here in the air and we're touching the clay, look at how freely my arms move side to side. That is not good for stability. What we want are for our arms to be tight, locked into our core and down into our legs. So your arms, your elbows should always be right here tight into your core. Then you're going to lean forward into the clay. You use the entire upper body to move into the clay. That keeps us in a very stable place. Also, we want our hands to be connected. If my hands are touching the clay here, even if my elbows are locked in nice and tight, but my hands are separate, they move separately. What we want is for this triangular tripod kind of effect that you get from two elbows being locked into your core and your hands connected to one another. Now, when one hand, the other hand moves, and now I'm actually much more stable than I was when I had two free hands that could move in any direction. This is the position that we will want to start with as we begin to center our clay. So centering the clay is where we take the ball of clay, we put it right in the middle of the bat on our wheel head, and we try to slowly move the clay to a perfect center so that it barely looks like it's moving at all while the wheel spins. It's centered when your hands no longer wobble back and forth. So the position that I'm putting my hands in, I'm taking my left hand, which is my non-dominant hand because I'm throwing right-handed, which means my wheel is spinning counterclockwise. If you are left-handed, you will use one of the green wheels that has the ability to switch, and you will flip the toggle switch that is at the very bottom underneath the motor, and you switch it all the way to the opposite direction. And now notice that the wheel spins clockwise. So that's how you will change. It's at the very bottom underneath the motor, so it's really close to the ground. All right, now that my wheel is spinning back in the correct direction for me, we are going to continue our talk on the body position and placement. The hands, when we go into center, I like to take my left hand and put it out kind of like I'm going to give somebody a handshake. Then I take my right hand and I lock onto the thumb by wrapping my hand around the top here. This way, I can use this back end of the left hand to push into the clay. I can use this bottom part of the right hand to press down on the clay. And so we have two directions, that vertical direction and that horizontal direction, moving the clay to the center of the wheel. Positioning is very, very important as we begin to learn to wheel throw. Without proper stability and without proper positioning of your hands, you will find it very difficult to find success in centering and then pulling the walls of a piece of clay. So now that we have that, we've got our wheel ready to go. We've got our sponge and we've got our bucket of water. Those are the only two things that we will need for this beginning stage. We have our ball of clay, and so we're going to take that ball of clay, which has already been wedged, which is the mixing the clay up around itself to make sure there's no air pockets. We've now got that all ready to go, so we're going to take this ball of clay and we're going to smack it down in the center of the wheel. I tend to spin my wheel so that I can visually see where the center is, and then I take my ball of clay and hold it right up above that center, and I guide it all the way down to the very bottom until it smacks and sticks on there. It is very important that with our plastic bats that you do not add water. No water whatsoever should be on the wheel when you are applying the clay. The clay will stick to this because it is shiny plastic. So that will help. If you add water, you will create a barrier and your clay will slip and slide all the way off and it will never stick to the bat. So you want to be very careful and only keep it nice and clean and dry whenever you apply fresh clay. So we've found our center and we're going to guide this down. So I've guided that down and you can hear that that deep thud. That was because I was putting a bit of force behind it. So now the clay doesn't want to move away from there. Now let's spin the wheel and see what the clay looks like. Is it centered? It is not perfectly centered, and you can tell that because it moves back and forth, back and forth, back and forth as it spins around. This is why we take our hands and we start to move the clay to center. This is that first step, centering the clay. Centering the clay is where the majority of our muscle power has to go into. The rest of it is a very delicate process. So at this point, we're going to start the centering of the clay. If you do not center the clay properly first, you will always have difficulty in every other stage of the process because everything else depends upon the clay being centered. So the ball of clay is stuck onto the bat. We are now going to take our sponge with water and we are going to wring out quite a bit of water on our wheel. Notice that it just kind of floats all the way down around. We want the wheel and the ball of clay to be completely coated in water. We'll now dip our hands in that bucket of water, and I'm going to keep a little bit of water in my sponge as I do this. So remember now, arms locked in tight to the core. We're going to use this back end of the left hand to press into the clay. We're going to use the right hand, the fatty part by the pinky, to press down on the top of the clay, and this is going to move the clay to the center. Hands are going to be tight together. Legs are wrapped around the wheel. Wheel will be moving about medium speed, medium to medium fast. So the wheel is spinning about the speed that we're going to start with, and so now we will start to move into the clay. The heel pressing against the back and the fatty part of the palm pressing down. I'm squeezing a little bit of water out as I move this to center. I'm going to speed the wheel up just a little bit. Slowly pull away when I think I'm getting a little bit dry. And I want you to look at my hands real quick. Notice the only sections of my hands that have clay on them. This back section right here, because that is the only part of this hand that is pressing into the clay. This is what's doing a lot of the work. This is important because this is straight in front of my arm, which is locked tight into my core. This is what allows us to have stability. If you were to use your fingertips have all these joints that can move. Whereas here, we have only one that can move, and that is the elbow. And so that elbow is what really tells us, it helps us to give the pressure in that we need. On my right hand, the only part of that hand that was touching the clay was this part of my palm. So I was pressing down and in from the side with this hand, down from the top with this hand. And so that's the only two parts of your hand that really should have clay on them. My fingertips do a little bit because I wrap my hand all the way around just for stability. But those two parts here, here and here, are the only two parts that really should touch the clay. So now that I have this almost centered, it's pretty close. You don't see much wobble in there, but I feel a little bit of a wobble along the side. I'm going to go back in and do a refinement centering. So this is really more, takes a little bit of finesse, which just means that it's going to be a little bit more gentle as I press into it, but holding my hands really tight and stable. Spinning the wheel faster. And slowly pull away. This looks a little bit better to me. It's a little bit more stable around the side here, and it looks like everything else is pretty good. So now we're going to start the next section. The next section is to open the clay. Opening is where we make the clay look essentially like a donut. We open up the center of the clay in order to then pull it apart to make the walls of our piece. Opening the clay is a very gentle process where we take our fingers. I like to use my left hand thumb and my right hand middle finger and pointer finger, and I put them together. This keeps that triangle very stable position like we've used already. And I use that to press down into the clay, right over the very center top. As we begin to open this centered ball of clay, we've zoomed in just a little bit so that you can see what my fingers are actually doing. Like I said, we're going to be taking that thumb and then the other fingers, the pointer and middle finger on the right hand, to move us down into. My arms are still locked tight into my core. We're just going to be moving our fingers straight down in the center. So I like to start with my fingers towards the outside edge because this helps me see if the top is actually level or not. And we're going to be slowly moving our fingers in, adding just even pressure all the way to the center. And as I find the center, I just made a little bit of a divot, just a tiny little spot there. I keep adding water with my sponge because we have to keep the clay lubricated. If we don't keep it lubricated, then the clay will start to stick to your hand and it will pull it off center, and then you have a giant wobble. If that happens now, we can fix it by recentering the clay just like we did before, just like this. But if we have already opened the clay and then it gets dry and then it becomes off center, it is almost, not completely, but almost impossible to recenter that clay. So that is why it's very important to keep the clay hydrated. And your hands. So now we're going to move in and we're going to open the ball of clay. We're going to keep the wheel spinning about medium speed as we go into this. Sliding my fingers straight to the center here. And I'm really using mostly the thumb and that middle finger as I slowly, very slowly press down. Now, because you are so close to the center of the wheel, it spins very close. So all the clay that you're touching a lot all at the same time. So it dries very quickly. So what we do is we add a little bit of water into that little opening that we've created, and this way it keeps it lubricated so that as we continue to press down, it will not be too far. It will not dry down too much as we go down further. So we're slowly adding pressure, Started to dry down a little bit more, so I'm going to add more water in there. And then as I finish and I get towards the bottom where I'm stopping, I kind of pull my fingers back towards me a little bit so that it keeps this open just a little bit more. Now there's a little flange up here that kind of pops up, and so I'm going to take my hand and very steadily together press that down nice and even, just to hide that away. Smooth that down and out. Now the next step here is going to involve a needle tool, where we're going to be checking the thickness on the inside of our piece. Every piece you make should be tested with the needle tool to make sure that the thickness in the bottom is sufficient. So to do this, what we do is we take our needle tool, we take our finger, and so we can slide our finger straight up and down the blade of the needle tool. We will hold our hand straight up and down, and while the wheel is not spinning, stopped, just stable still, we take the needle tool and we press the needle tool down through the bottom. Slide your finger up and down until you hit the bottom of the piece. Pull it out, and as you pull out, do not remove your finger. Keep your finger stable just where it is. This tells us that our piece here is this thick. This is approximately a half an inch, maybe a little bit more than half an inch. That's about where we want the piece to be, because that gives us enough room so that we can trim the piece later. So that tells me that we're good. But now we have a hole in the inside of our piece because of the needle tool. So now all we have to do is wet a finger down, spin the wheel, and we're going to start to press down into the base again, just very gently from the outside edge of the inside to the very center, and then back out to the outside, and that seals that hole so that we never see it again. It's all completely closed back up. We've compressed the clay to make it completely disappear. Our next step is to pull the clay out and start to pull the walls. So we're going to pull out, and then we're going to pull vertical to lift the walls. So to go back in here and pull this straight out, I'm going to do the same thing that we did when we opened the piece, but now we're going to just very gently pull straight back to us. Very important that your arms are locked tight and that the clay is lubricated. The moment you feel it stick, squeeze water into it. You only need to pull out as far as you think that you need for the base to be, because now this gives us the position that we need to start pulling the walls. So after we have centered, we have opened, we've checked the thickness of our base, we now begin the process of pulling the walls. This is where people tend to pull the clay off center because they don't position their hands equally and stably along the clay. So when we pull the wall, essentially what we're trying to do is stretch the clay vertical and make it go up in the air. In this case, we're going to be making it go up and out because we're making a bowl. It's going to be moving to the outside. So what we're going to do here is take our hands in like a claw. This is our left hand if you are right-handed throwing. Your left hand is going to make a claw like this. Thumb will be on the outside and the middle finger will be on the inside. This typically happens between the 5 and 6 o'clock position. So 6 o'clock is right straight in front of you. 5 o'clock is to the right-hand side. Everything that we do when we are pulling the wall is going to be in this section between the 5 and 6 o'clock position over here. So now what we're going to do to stabilize this, because we always want our hands to be connected, our right hand will be connected to our thumb and our left hand to our left thumb, and our left middle finger will be on the inside. This is where we will start to squeeze together like this, squeeze together, and then we will start to lift up and out. It is important that we keep enough water on here so that our fingers do not stick. It is also, as we go through this process of pulling the wall, we also want to remember that this is not a one-time deal. You can pull the wall multiple times. You do not want to go too thin too quickly. If you go too thin, then the piece may become off-center and wobbly and it may fall apart. That is very likely to happen. At some point, everybody has a flop. That's what we call it. It's a flop. It's not a big deal, but just keep in mind, if you do this in intervals and do it in sections, One pull squeezes in a little bit, lift. Next pull squeezes in a little bit more, lift. Next pull squeezes in even more, and lift. Eventually, you're going to get that wall to the thickness that you want, which in wheel throwing is about 1/4 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch is a good thickness for a typical wheel thrown bowl or cup. So, we're now going to put our hands on the clay. The wheel has been spinning. You'll notice that as I throw, I do not touch the clay unless the wheel is spinning. Because I leave the wheel spinning all the time, my hands can touch it whenever I want. But I don't stop the wheel and touch the clay. That is the best way to throw your clay off center, is to touch it while it's not spinning. So only touch the clay while it's spinning. Once the wheel is spinning to the speed, which in this case is about medium speed for the pulling, we're going to put our hands together. I'm going to have that sponge in my right hand too, so that I can squeeze it if I need a little bit of water. I'm going to put my fingers together, my right hand connected, thumb connected with the other left hand thumb, and my fingers will be on the outside here. Left hand will be on the inside. What's going to happen is our outside fingers are actually going to be just a little bit lower than the inside because of the base. So our outside fingers will be a little bit lower. We'll be squeezing in and lifting up and out. We'll go back down, we'll squeeze again and lift up and out. So right now I'm working on keeping my arms tight into my core. My hands are connected. The wheel is spinning about medium speed, a little bit slower. And we're going to start to squeeze our fingers together. This is a process that utilizes just really the fingertips. I feel my hand on the inside getting sticky, so I'm slowly pulling away and releasing that pressure so that I can add water. If I didn't, my entire piece would go off center, and that is not a good thing. So now you can see that we've lifted this wall just a little bit. There's a little bit of a ledge underneath on the outside and the inside. We're going to go back to that same ledge, and we're going to continue the pull where I left off. As I get here to the rim, I stop before I go over the top. Too many people go straight off all the way up. That's not a good thing to do. You want to keep the rim just a little bit on the thicker side, especially as we continue to pull. So sometimes the rim will get a little bit wobbly. You can take your left hand, middle finger, and thumb on the outside and inside of the piece, and that right hand can put the middle finger straight down on top. It creates this little kind of three-sided box. And we can press down on the clay very steady with our arms nice and tight, and that moves the rim back down to a level. I'm going to soak up some of this water on the inside and then reapply that water down the wall. So now we've still got quite a bit of thickness in the base here. There's a lot of thickness down here. So we're going to push this in a little bit more as we pull the wall up and out. Starting back here in the very center, moving my finger to the outside, finding it nice and smooth and level. The outside hand, my hand has to be a little bit more arched now because the bowl is growing, it's getting taller. So on the outside here, we're going to be continuing on by pressing our fingers together, squeezing them together gently for our next level of pull. And I've created a little bit of a ledge down here. You can kind of see that ledge. That's going to help me lift this clay. As I lift, I move my hands out. And when I get here towards the top, I'm not actually squeezing together anymore. I am only moving the clay. I'm trying to squeeze the clay at the base to get it where I want it because it is too thick. But at the top here, it was already a little bit thinner, so I didn't need to squeeze it anymore. You want the walls to end up being 1/4 of an inch thick all the way through, not just in some spots. So that's why you don't want to over squeeze around the top rim. Now let's go back down in here, and for our third pull, this is going to be more of a shaping pull. So I'm locking my hands together still, just like I was before. And we're going to shape this bowl where we want it to really end up being. So we've now shaped our bowl by lifting and moving the clay in the directions that we wanted it to go. I can double check my rim here and make sure that's fairly level. I can now take one of our other tools. In this case, it's a metal rib. The metal rib is really nice for cleaning up the outside shape. See how in my hand here, I can take the metal rib, and on the curved side, I can bend the metal rib with my fingers on the outside and thumb on the inside to make it curved. That's going to help me get a nice, gentle shape on the outside of this piece. I wet the rib down, and then I use my left hand inside to stabilize, and I use the right hand on the outside to slide against the piece. So let's see how this works. We take the base of the rib against the base of our piece, and then on the inside we're going to very slowly start to kind of press out until we get kind of the shape that we want. We can do a similar thing on the inside, taking it and curving it the opposite direction, and we can very gently, still on this right-hand side, we can take our hand and we can gently run through the inside. So now we can do a final check here and see if our thickness is pretty close. I feel a little thin towards the top, but we can't fix that at this point. So now we have made a wheel-thrown bowl. We've pulled the walls. The rim is pretty centered, and the base is fairly centered as well. Now we're going to check and see how well we actually did. I'm going to take my wire cutter here and cut off our piece. When you are making your wheel-thrown vessels, you're going to take the wire cutter and put it underneath here and pull all the way back through. Nice and tight in your hands like this, locked in tight, and you'll pull all the way through. I'm only going to pull part way because I'm going to cut ours in half so that we can see how well we threw this piece. So if we look at the wall thickness here, we see that it gets a little bit thinner as it goes up here towards the top. The base thickness is really good. This is where we want it to be. Let's check and see exactly how deep that base was. The base thickness was a little bit more than a ½ an inch, kind of in between the 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch. That's good. That gives us enough space that we can trim our foot, which will be seen in another segment of this wheel throwing process. And the thickness down here along these sides is an area that will be trimmed away later as well. So this is really good here at the base. We got a little bit thin as we went up here into the wall. This is not too thin, but it is just a little bit on the thin side up here. This is probably a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch, and then this section right in here is where we want the entire thing to really be. This is a nice 1/4 of an inch thickness. So there you have it. This is the process of wheel throwing from start to finish. You will not cut your pieces all in half, but this way we can kind of see what the clay is doing whenever we are moving our hands in those specific positions to stretch the wall and to pull the clay. So occasionally it is a good idea to go through and cut a piece in half. and check the thickness and see where you're leaving clay a little too thick, where you're pulling the clay a little bit too thin. I recommend doing that as a good practice, as a good potter. Thank you for watching, and as always, go make some pots.